Deep inside a remote cave system in northern Spain, a gruesome investigation is underway. It involves the shattered remains of a group of people. They were discovered in March 1994, when cavers exploring El Cidron cave system deviated from the main tunnel to climb up into a small side gallery.
Hey, I found something! Looks like human bones.
The remains are reported to authorities. Partial skeletons of 4 humans are exhumed. They are in pieces. Police and cavers note that the bones don't look very old, certainly no older than 60 or 70 years. They believe they're looking at the remains of victims of the Spanish Civil War.
They couldn't see yet that there were cut marks on the bones, clear signs of cannibalism.
In Madrid, investigators compared the bones to other human remains. They did not belong to war victims. They came from another time, and they were another people. Neanderthal. From the cliffs of Gibraltar to the depths of El Cidron cave, scientists must reach back in time to identify the dead and reconstruct their final days. But can they find enough evidence to crack this oldest of cold cases? Below this valley floor lies the El Cidron cave system. Here, a forensics investigation has been in progress for over a decade. The location where the bones were found is now known as the Ossuary Gallery. Every year, more and more relics are exhumed, and the number of dead rises. Scientists from across Spain have joined forces. Human fossil expert Antonio Rosas from Madrid's National Museum of Natural Sciences leads the investigation. Carles Lalauesa Fox, a world-renowned geneticist from the Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Barcelona, hunts for ancient DNA. Archaeologist Marco de la Razia is now on his way from Oviedo University to the annual dig. He is in charge of the excavation. His final destination, a hidden river valley in northern Spain. Most of the young researchers who join the dig are Marco's students. They come every summer to spend up to a month working on the site. The Ossuary Gallery is 220 meters from the main entrance. The entire tunnel stretches for nearly 4 kilometers. Rain above can flood the cave, making it sometimes extremely dangerous to work here. A puddle can grow into a raging torrent very quickly. The Ossuary Gallery, where the bones were found, is slightly higher than the main tunnel. It is safe from flooding, but not from looters. In the first years of the dig, fossils were stolen. A steel cage now keeps the precious remains safe, 23 meters below the earth.
Because we're used to working in caves, this one was just another cave, but it proved more interesting because it was like a container of rather unusual remains.
Remains that would take years to unearth using only brushes and spades, transforming the once tiny gallery into a chamber of mazes. The site is cramped and difficult to traverse. But in this confined space, over 1,000 human bone fragments and hundreds of stone tools have so far been found. Every single relic and the soil that surrounds them are examined, cleaned, and logged. The stone tools are Mousterian, the same as those found in a normal Neanderthal's toolbox. But the mystery of their presence here, alongside so many human bones, has haunted the scientists from the very first day of the excavation.
Once we had started the excavation in El Cidrón, the big question was, what were the human remains doing there? We didn't know what it was used for. It could have been a home, a burial ground, or the remains could have come from somewhere else and were in a secondary position. We just didn't know.
As the bones and stone tools are excavated and their exact location is plotted, it seems they're all in the same layer of ancient soil. 1 meter deep, 6 meters square. And they find something else. Random dating reveals the relics are all around the same age, 49,000 years. It looks as if something or someone buried these relics here at the same time. John Hawkes is a human evolution expert. He has visited dozens of the world's most important ancient human sites and collections. At the Vienna Natural History Museum, a much-awaited human evolution exhibition has just opened its doors to him. As a Neanderthal specialist, he has watched the unfolding investigation at El Cidrón with great interest. The cave is unlike most other Neanderthal sites.
When an archaeologist is excavating a site and he finds things that are together in a fairly narrow layer, that still doesn't mean that they're deposited there at the same time. Time is compressing. There could be hundreds, maybe even thousands of years in that archaeological deposit. It's very rare to come across a place like El Cidrón, where it looks like things might have been deposited at the very same time.
Sites that Neanderthals occupied usually contain evidence of everyday life, like the bones of the animals they used for food and clothing over many, many generations. But the bones of the people themselves may be scarce. El Cidrón has very few animal bones and a large amount of human remains, raising doubts that people actually lived there.
The cave at El Cidrón is a cold place. It doesn't look like it would be a great place to live, and especially where you find these bones. It is not typical for where we find Neanderthal occupations.
Neanderthal occupation sites were open to fresh air, but also protected. Neanderthal real estate ranged from the humble rock shelter by a quiet stream to cathedral-like rock towers along the Mediterranean. Scientists are studying both of these contrasting environments. But who were the Neanderthals?
The Neanderthals were the people that occupied the western half of Eurasia, basically Central Asia, Europe, from 300,000 years ago or so up to about 30,000 years ago. They were always a very small population, maybe less than 50,000 people, and they lived in a climate that fluctuated widely, from relatively warm periods, like today, to very cold glacial conditions. We used to think of Neanderthals as being basically hunters, and they were eating a very, very high proportion of meat. We've begun to find evidence that they were making use of a wider range of resources. They were masters of knowing what foods were available in their environment. We know from their genetics that Neanderthals are a part of us, but they're not the same as us. And so when we look at them, we have to make that adjustment that we're looking at somebody very close to ourselves, but maybe not quite like ourselves.
Inside El Cedron, investigators work to uncover a moment in time in the lives of a people who have always intrigued us. The truth behind what happened here can only be deduced from a thorough forensics investigation. The scientists already know El Cedron was not a typical Neanderthal home, and they know the stone tools and bones were all buried together around 49,000 years ago. But can they find out why they are here? And who or what brought them into this place? The first major clue comes from the fossilized bones. In Madrid, Antonio Rosas struggles to refit the Neanderthal remains to find out how many bodies are in the cave. In the process, he discovers what really happened here. He's found cut marks in significant places on leg bones and jaw bones.
This means that parts of the bodies were cut with the intention of ripping away the flesh.
Some of the bones have been cracked by force.
Here we can see an impact mark on this leg bone fragment. This means that the bone has been struck and broken with a stone in order to reach the bone marrow inside, which is very nutritious.
Evidence enough for Antonio Rosas to come to a conclusion.
In El Cedron, there was an incident of cannibalism.
It is really some of the strongest evidence that we have from any Neanderthal site that cannibalism was why those bones got there.
But can we know who cannibalized these Neanderthal people? Was it our Homo sapiens ancestors?
Toward the end of their existence, after 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals declined in numbers, they declined in geographic range. It's obvious we had something to do with it because modern humans show up in Europe at that time. But at the time of El Cedron, there are no evidences of modern humans being anywhere near the area. So it looks like Neanderthals were responsible, at least as far as the evidence we have right now. When we want to understand why Neanderthals would have turned to cannibalism, we have to look at the circumstances in which humans become cannibals. When you look across human cultures, it happens surprisingly often. It happens in a lot of cases because of hunger. It's true desperation, where the only food source you have available to you is the bodies of your dead, or maybe not yet dead, comrades. There are other contexts, though. There are ritual contexts in which you're trying to capture the spirits of dead people who may have been dear to you. There are contexts where you've conquered people and you want to capture their energy by eating their remains. It is truly culturally complex in humans, and we have no reason to think that in Neanderthals it would have been less complex.
What is the real significance of this occurrence of cannibalism? Are they symbolic or cultural reasons? At the moment, we don't have any evidence to show that a ritual occurred here.
Were all Neanderthals cannibals? We are beginning to find that Neanderthal people lived in different environments and probably had different lifestyles. To place the El Cedron cannibalism in perspective, scientists are exploring a completely different site at the other end of the Iberian Peninsula, where no evidence of Neanderthal cannibalism has ever been found. Clive Finlayson is an evolutionary ecologist. He thinks he's found a Neanderthal Shangri-La.
As you come round on a boat and look at this cliff face, you don't just see one cave, Gorham's Cave. You see another cave and others going underwater, and they were all occupied by Neanderthals. This was the Neanderthal city.
El Cedron is dark and cool. The path to Gorham's Cave is bright and hot.
The Neanderthals have been living in Gibraltar for a long time, probably much longer than 60,000 years ago. The surprising thing here was not when they started, but when they finished. And we found a campfire at the top of Gorham's Cave, which we excavated, and we took samples for radiocarbon dating. And the surprising result that came back was 28,000 years. That makes them the most recent population of Neanderthals to have survived anywhere on the planet today.
El Cedron's story is of an instance in time. Inside Gorham's Cave, events that happened over tens of thousands of years are being pieced together. Clive's team have excavated hundreds of Mousterian stone tools believed to have been made by the Neanderthals. Underwater archaeologist Geraldine Finlayson has been working on the site with Clive since 1997.
For a long time, Neanderthals were thought to have mainly been eating meat. But we find certainly in this part of the world that they eat a lot of shellfish. And here behind me, we've got different layers, like layers in a cake. And scattered among the layers, you can still see the remains of the shells that they have collected. We also find fish bones and fish scales inside the cave. It's very easy to collect fish. You don't need a rod or a line to catch a fish. If you just toss a stone at them, you can knock them out. So they can be quite easy to catch.
They ate all kinds of things, whatever was out there. If you put it together, all that's missing to make a good Mousterian Neanderthal paella is rice. Outside the cave, the view is not the one the Neanderthals would have had for most of the time. The sea level was much lower because global climate was much cooler. The coast was 4 to 5 kilometers out. The seabed, which is well submerged now, would have been the landscape where they went out, hunted, and gathered, and then they came back into this cave for shelter and protection.
Geraldine and her dive buddy archaeologist Darren Farr are about to dive on the landscape that existed when Neanderthals lived here, and the sea level was much lower. It's a unique and very new investigation. Large pinnacles rise up from the seabed, and at their base, freshwater springs have been found.
We can see valleys, we can see river gullies, and we actually found upwellings of fresh water. So they would have had a lagoon-type system in front of the cave. So you can imagine that would have attracted water birds, a whole bunch of other things. So it was actually quite an idyllic landscape for them to survive in, possibly explaining why they lasted here so long.
Collecting rock from the pinnacles to compare with stone tools found in the cave will connect the two sites. But the real work ahead involves undertaking land-based archaeology at depth, setting up grid lines, digging and recording with meticulous method. If this was the landscape of the Neanderthals, perhaps their bones are still here. The past does not give up its secrets easily. In the depths of El Cidrón, the scientists know Neanderthals were cannibalized by their own kind. But their task is far from over. Finding out how their remains and tools came to be down this hole will involve an extraordinary piece of detective work.
For the scientists, figuring out how the bones and the stones ended up in this place in the cave was really the breakthrough.
It happens during closer investigation of the stone tools. In their laboratory at the University of Oviedo, Marco and his team come across something very strange. El Cidrón is not a place where Neanderthals lived, but the scientists find proof that stone tools were manufactured there.
We found evidence of the production of what we call lithic flakes.
Lithic flakes are a byproduct of napping a core of rock. El Cidrón volunteer Lalo Arena has mastered the art of stone tool manufacture.
With this tool, you can cut meat, make other tools, and even crack bones. It's as sharp as a razor blade.
By looking closely at the edges of lithic flakes and what they suspect are cores, Marco's team see a pattern. They attempt to refit the pieces. Here is irrefutable evidence of a moment 49,000 years ago when someone made stone tools. But these tools were not made inside the El Cidrón cave. If they were, some of the flakes would have been found close to each other when they were excavated. Lalo's experiments have shown the flakes don't scatter, but the fitted pieces were scattered up to a meter away from one another. It's as if they were dropped onto the ossuary gallery from above. They find many more stone flakes, rock cores, and even pieces of bone in this exact configuration. When all the finds at the site are plotted, another pattern emerges, a cone shape, It's known as a debris flow cone.
In El Cedron, we have a cone of sediment, and it represents something that just fell into the cave.
When this geological phenomena occurred, everything moved inside. So logically, everything appeared together.
And the stone tools that were used to take flesh from bone are still as sharp as the day they were made.
The fact that everything appeared together inside the cave means there was a clear activity related to cannibalism, and the stone tools were used for that purpose.
The El Cedron investigators find a logical point where the bones and stone tools entered, right above the ossuary gallery. It no longer opens to the surface. The real story of what happened to the people of El Cedron is outside. The karst landscape above the cave is constantly reshaping itself. Huge sinkholes appear when acidic rain dissolves the limestone. They will eventually crumble into caverns below. But the collapse in El Cedron was not a slow process. If it was, the remains would have been scavenged. Wolves and other predators shared the Neanderthals' world.
The fact that there were very few carnivore teeth marks shows us that the bones, the bodies, were only exposed to the air for a short period. The burial process was very fast.
It is amazing how many things had to fall into place in order for all of this evidence to tell us what happened at a moment in time in the Neanderthal life. And that evidence in the archaeological record is so rare, so lucky, that it blows my mind that we're able to figure out what happened at a particular moment.
Close by El Cedron is La Cabanina. The investigators believe a shelter like this one could have been directly above the ossuary gallery 49,000 years ago. In ancient times, there was a stream nearby, similar to the one that runs near La Cabanina today. The scientists suspect that a huge storm caused flash flooding across the fragile karst areas, resulting in the sudden collapse that brought the remains into El Cedron.
The cave must have been practically like it is now, and in the same way we could live here, they could have done so in the past. There is a roof, water, the basic conditions that they would have needed. There is also silex, the material they used for their tools. They would have lived here very happily.
But there was death, an ancient cold case that the investigators of El Cedron have reached across time to solve. It started with a storm.
This is the first time that we have a discovery like this with Neanderthals, where you have a group of individuals that probably knew each other when they were alive.
Now, the greatest challenge facing the scientists is to give these people back their identities. But it's difficult enough to estimate the number buried inside El Cidrón. The bones are in fragments, and they don't fit together to make even one whole person. In Madrid, Antonio Rosas and his team have spent a decade trying to get to know the victims of El Cidrón better. He has led a meticulous forensics investigation to find the age, sex, and health of the victims. Each year, more evidence is exhumed, and the death toll alters. It started at 4. It is now much, much higher. The reconstructions have to be done with teeth. Scientist Almudena Estelrich knows every one of them.
We know that the teeth belong to a certain kind of individual for many reasons. In the first place, the wear is the same. In other words, all the teeth are in the same state, eroded or not eroded. And mainly because of the marks on the sides of the teeth, caused by friction. So they serve as a kind of fingerprint. They're the same now as when the teeth were together.
In this way, they discover a much higher death toll than ever expected.
There are 12 individuals represented, 6 adults and 6 children. Among the children, there are 3 teenagers close to maturity. There is one child around 5 years of age, another approximately 8 years old, and a very young one of around 2 years of age.
The investigators know the Neanderthals' age and sex. They know they were cannibalized and how they came to be inside the cave. But there is one more thing they hope to find. Something that may offer the ghosts of El Cidrón a type of immortality. Their ancient DNA. Genetics. The new wave of Neanderthal science is about to take the investigation into another realm. In Barcelona, Carles Lalawesa Fox wants to give ancient people back their identity.
I wanted to try to provide an image of the Neanderthals that could be not just generic Neanderthals, but persons with their own traits like just the modern humans.
At the Institute of Evolutionary Biology, Lalawesa Fox specializes in the extraction and analysis of ancient DNA.
Because we are alone, and we know for sure that we have been alone for thousands of years in this planet, we don't have the concept of what a different human species would be. For us, it's very difficult to imagine someone who would be at the same time very similar to us, but also at the same time fundamentally different to us. And that is what a Neanderthal would be. Going into the cave, I discovered that was a very special site, probably a unique site, because the temperature was so stable all along the year, and it has been stable during at least 50,000 years. And I thought, we are going to find DNA preserved in Neanderthals. It's going to be there. I was given a tooth first to check if there was Neanderthal DNA on it. After several weeks, I was able to retrieve Neanderthal DNA from that particular tooth, but also discovered that the tooth was plagued with Homo sapiens DNA.
Our DNA is very similar to Neanderthal DNA. Right from the very beginning of the El Cidrón discovery, cavers, police, and even the scientists were contaminating the Neanderthal DNA with their own.
It's difficult to believe, but if you breathe over the bones or you touch a particular bone fragment or a Neanderthal tooth, your DNA can go from the outside into the inside of the specimen.
Carles knew he could not waste this extraordinary opportunity.
I decided to implement an anti-contamination protocol at the excavation itself. I put my lab into the excavation.
A bone being tested for ancient DNA is not exposed to air until the dig is stopped. The site is locked down, the excavator suits up, and then extracts the remains with sterilized utensils. Carles also ensured that the DNA of everyone who comes close to the bones and teeth is recorded so he can discount their DNA signature from his results.
We were able to know exactly who was contaminating the remains, and we were also able to compare the Neanderthal sequences with all the sequences of the people that had been not just touching the remains, but close to the remains into the excavation itself.
The El Cidrón protocol will change the way that ancient DNA is collected and tested. In his hands, Carles may hold clues to the identity of some of the El Cidrón victims. The bone powder drilled from inside the sample will need to go through many processes before Carles knows his protocol has been successful. And if DNA is found, it'll be in fragments that will have to be magnified, replicated, and reconstructed. He's looking for nuclear DNA, passed down from both parents, the DNA responsible for an individual's traits. El Cidrón bones will help create a new vision of Neanderthals.
We had an image of what Neanderthals could look like, and what we could say is that Neanderthals had likely red hair. They were O blood group. They were able to have this bitter taste perception, and they probably had language abilities like us.
This is the first model of a Neanderthal based on genetic evidence. But in this prehistoric cold case, here's one step further to go. To find out if members of her group were related. To do that, he must look for another type of DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down from mothers to their children. Because it changes at a very predictable rate over generations, it can trace lineage back to ancestors who lived hundreds of thousands of years ago. The results will soon establish if this group of 12 are related.
The people of El Cidrón, they were family related. We don't know exactly which were the relationships, but we know they were family related. all the three adult males had exactly the same mitochondrial DNA, while the three adult females had different mitochondrial DNA, which is shown in modern hunter-gatherer groups where the females move from one group to another while the males stay in their paternal family group.
Two of the women were directly related to children from the group. They could have been their mothers. It's a first real proof of a Neanderthal social structure.
Here's a case where we have maternal relatives. That does tell us something about the way that ancient human groups may have begun to be composed. For this set of Neanderthals, what looks like happened is that the women were going from one group to another, probably at the time that they began to mate. And so that tells us how the genes are moving across Neanderthal populations. They're moving with women.
Marco de la Rezia has found proof that groups did exist in the area and that they were on the move.
The silex we have discovered here was used by these groups, but it can also be found in other areas near and far. Therefore, we can conclude that they moved around and took raw materials from one place to another, for hunting or for work, for what they needed on their journeys to different places.
When you start losing little groups because things become harsher, then you have a situation that puts the entire population genetically at risk. They can't maintain their adaptability to new circumstances.
The death of a family could leave surrounding groups isolated. The distance they had to travel to exchange females would be too great, and eventually inbreeding would halt the vital flow of genes that leads to evolution.
We can see an event here where we had people that were very hungry, where they were not able to survive without turning to cannibalism, and that puts the entire survival of this broad population into a very interesting context.
So why did populations of Neanderthals begin to shrink? Some say our arrival in Eurasia was the beginning of the end. Clive Finlayson believes climate was the killer.
Climate change affected the environments that these people occupied across central parts of Europe and even central parts of Asia and even northern Europe.
Ice core data from Greenland shows that between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, the climate seesawed between warm wet periods and cold dry periods. The El Cidrón act of cannibalism coincides with the very beginning of this time.
As that climate changed, their landscape, their environment, which was a wooded environment where they would ambush hunt animals, began to shrink. Gradually, the population was being pushed back into these strongholds like the one we find here. They were becoming like pandas or tigers. The populations were isolated from each other, and there was very little gene flow between them. And therefore, they were suffering from inbreeding and all the kinds of effects that small populations have. They were there, but their days were numbered. Those Neanderthals were living dead.
So far, there is no evidence to point to climate as the killer in El Cidrón. But these Neanderthals would have needed to consume a huge amount of food. Getting enough energy to survive even an ordinary winter would have been a challenge.
It is thought that the composition of the Neanderthal body, not only because of its size, but also due to the muscular thickness of the limbs and torso, needed a large amount of daily energy for its metabolism. This means that an individual's daily consumption of calories, proteins, and other nutrients must have been very high. Thus, certain unfavorable environmental conditions could have led to physiological stress brought on by food shortages.
But we do know what some of the family were eating during their lives at El Cidrón. The teeth of 5 family members have been analyzed. calcified dental plaque removed.
On the surfaces of teeth of any kind of human, we sometimes will find calcified plaque. Your dentist scrapes that off. You know, it's hard work to get it off of there. But what it's doing is it's capturing little particles of the food that you eat. And those little particles include microfossils. From that, you can tell what kinds of plant foods were being eaten.
Molecules of cooked grains and also traces of bitter green plants were found. The presence of bitter plants has led to speculation that these people were using plants as medicines.
El Cedron puts this really interesting perspective on this new evidence about plant utilization, because when we look at those people, we would initially look at them and say, look at the breadth of resources that they're using. They're masters of knowing what's in the landscape. But at the same time, we know that they're in a population that has times of real desperation. And so when we look at the evidence of these bitter plants on their teeth, what we begin to think is, oh, maybe they're really stretching to the limit, trying to get every possible food that they can, and at the end, it just didn't go well for this small group of people.
A family was wiped out in El Cedron, eaten by their own kind. Perhaps because of something as simple as hunger.
When we look across Neanderthal sites all over Europe, we see clear signs of stress. We see their teeth are having problems when they're forming, which represents, times of hardship when they're growing up. We see evidence of hard lives all over their skeleton. And El Cedron is one piece of evidence that's really consistent with the entire picture. Neanderthal lives were, in many cases, hard.
Eventually, the Neanderthal population was whittled down to one person. That last Neanderthal may have lived in a place where food was always plentiful.
At the time of the people living in El Cedron, in that more cold northerly climate, are really having it hard to the point that they're eating each other. The Neanderthals down here carry on doing what they've always done. For 250,000 years, there's very little change in this part of the world. The climate is fairly mild, it gets slightly drier, slightly wetter. But then at 28,000 years, the cores tell us there were a series of droughts. There was a period which got really harsh, not cold, but dry. And not only did the Neanderthals disappear from here, but nobody else lived in here. And that is quite telling, I think, that Neanderthals survived for 250,000 years, and we suddenly lose the signal when we get the worst climatic conditions registered by the cores, marine cores outside this cave.
It must have been really very sad for the last few people to stay here and maybe realize that they didn't come into contact with other groups like they had been used to. They must have been the last one, and I always feel quite emotional when I think about them. "1,800 bones and 400 stone relics have been recovered, but this is not the end of the story. There may be more bodies in here." Antonio Rosas and Marco de la Racia will soon take this year's finds back to the laboratories for analysis.
2, 3, 4.
Until now, there has been no archaeological site in the world that has produced a greater number of bones than in El Cedron. It is an exceptional site on all counts. Finding 100 well-preserved Neanderthal remains at the same site every year is highly unusual. The extraordinary level of fossil preservation also makes this place absolutely unique.
There is nothing to add. It's just unique.
There's no limit to what we will discover as we get more and more methods of looking at this evidence. What a hard life these people led, and what a terrible way to go. We still can appreciate their lives and really begin to understand how they fit into this long term of existence of a very mysterious group of people.
They have been in the dark for 49,000 years. But they have only just begun to tell their secrets.